While we wait for the mics to get to people, let me just ask you. So there are different stages of journalism. There is the documentation, there is the selection of material, there is the distribution of material, and then there is this thing that happens afterwards, which has become much more blurry in the age of the internet, which is the response to the material. I think before the internet, we used to think of our work as stopping at the distribution, and whatever the response was, that was the response.
Yes.
Now we very much participate in that conversation, that engagement. It's one of the metrics in newsrooms that we talk about a lot. Of all of those stages, documentation, selection, distribution, engagement, which of those are activism and which of those are acts of neutrality?
Interesting question. I think for a photojournalist, the tough part is you capture a lot of images, but once you turn them over to your publisher, whoever's going to use them, you kind of lose control. And it's up to you to intercede to the best you can to make sure that that doesn't change what you're witnessing. So changing that image would be a form of activism. And then the idea that the story itself automatically or quickly becomes a Twitter feed, somebody shares it on Facebook, and there are comments back and forth, good, bad, this isn't right, it's all right. That's another form of activism because people are bringing together the people who side with them to agree with them on a certain aspect of it or disagree with them. So I think we have a lot of different groups, and they choose what they want to believe or not believe, and there's very little control on that.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think that documentation can be a form of neutrality, but the decision to document sometimes actually changes what's happened. I mean, you've certainly been in situations where pointing your camera at somebody changes the way they behave.
Yes, I remember doing my own media studies, and the part of that was a long time ago they had a violence in the media, and how does your presence in a particular scene affect what's going to happen? There are maybe some photographers who will get into a scene and urge somebody to do something totally wrong. The idea for me is always to be as invisible as you can, because once you get noticed, it does change what's happening. The crowd may get more anxious to raise their hands and shout out and stuff like that. Or if you're tape recording something, they see you've got a tape recorder or your phone out, they may start to give you more ammunition for what you're trying to do, and all of a sudden what you were doing, witnessing a quiet protest, becomes a violent protest because of your presence.
So if you think back to that day on campus here, there were a fair amount of media present. Right?
Yeah, yes.
Do you think that the presence of the media had any effect on the students or the National Guard?
I don't believe the media had any influence on any of that, because I see the Guard as being the form of activism, because they were making a social or political change by stopping a group that was also trying to make a political or social change. And they were going to do it whether their camera's there or not. And the students, their only form of anything was to leave the area as quickly as they could. And they weren't waiting to get your picture taken, throwing tear gas. That wasn't on anybody's mind. So I at that particular point, because the Guard seemed to be in control, the media had no influence on what happened that day.
Yeah, if anything, it's so astounding that they obviously knew that there were cameras present and that they acted as they did. seem to be acting with impunity.
Yeah, that you would think that they would say, I better be careful today what I do because they're recording me. And if I shoot somebody or if I hit somebody with my bayonet, somebody might see it and I'll get sued or something. So, yeah.
Yeah, or I'll bring disgrace on the institution that I represent, or, yeah, I mean, so many different things. So if you think, if you sort of fast forward to the last decade, the presence of cameras in the hands of citizens, mostly in the form of cell phones, and the ability to distribute those images has changed so much about what we understand about the world. If you think about the relationship between police and people of color, if you think about the documentation of migrants and their story, there's just so many stories that we wouldn't know now if citizens didn't both have the ability to quickly and effectively document something, but then also to distribute it. So what does that mean for the professional photojournalist? How does that change your job?
It makes it harder in some ways, I think. You can take your cell phone out into a crowd and no one would question you holding it up and taking some photos. They would just, it doesn't look professional. But you go out there with the camera like the gentleman on the left there or wherever the big camera, and all of a sudden they're saying, why are you taking my picture? If you use a nice sized telephoto lens or a 35 millimeter camera, that's suspect. But a cell phone doesn't raise that kind of concern. And yet the cell phone is going to distribute your picture and other pictures more widely than that professional photographer's going to go anywhere, if it even gets printed someplace. So it's changed a lot in terms of people don't realize, but I go back to the capturing images of police with blacks or any kind of social thing that's not right. That's a good thing in a way, because you and your cell phone are not encouraging anybody to do anything most of the time. As a matter of fact, they're probably trying to stop you if anything else, but it captures a truth that many people don't want captured, and that's one of the things that's changing our world today is people are finding out that they can't do things in the past, do things today that they could get away with in the past without getting some kind of documentation.
Yeah, there's much more scrutiny. All right, we have a question.
Hello, my name is Heather Bolstridge. I'm a communications manager in Akron for a few of the City of Akron's different projects, and I'm also a graduate from DIMFOS.
Oh, interesting.
And so, as a former military person who worked as a journalist on deployments for Hurricane Katrina, I feel like, for me, that photojournalism work really helped me see pictures differently. And so I was just interested in hearing just a little bit more about your experience in the military, and if you feel like that helps you not only feel more comfortable, especially in that kind of a situation, but also how that kind of shaped the way that you see pictures, because as you know, we get a lot of ethics training in the military as well.
Yeah. DINFOS was a really great place for me, and I was in the second graduating class of DINFOS in Fort Benjamin Harrison in Indiana in 1966. Kind of dates me. And it does teach you how to see things differently, and one from the perspective of learning how to frame a picture quickly. I mean, if you talk to anybody who's been in television news or on a live set, you don't have time to, I think I'll crop left or right. You do it, and you know how much headroom you have to have, you know which direction you're going, and you find that one of the things I did when I was in the military was I was stationed at the American Forces Philippines Network as initially I was just doing film editing, but I became the prime director for the station for a year and a half. And I did live news shows, I did live USO shows, and my photography grew because we didn't depend on the base photographers to do news stuff for us. I went out and took those pictures, and it wasn't my assignment, it wasn't something I had to do, But when the USO shows came on base and Bob Hope was there, or Art Linkletter, or any General Benjamin O. Davis, I went out and took his picture. We used it on the news. I gathered that experience because no one assigned me those things, which was really great. And so I had the freedom to record what I saw in a way that was pure. And so that's kind of my experience. It really, helped me get there.
It's so interesting because now I cannot imagine that the people who do those jobs now are not highly scripted by their superiors in this age of defining the narrative. Everybody seems to want to be very, manipulative is the wrong word, but defining the narrative of whatever you are, whether you're a military base or a political candidate or part of the bureaucracy of the government or a private citizen, that's one of the things that the internet has given everybody the ability to do, is to create a narrative or to tell a narrative that may not completely accurately reflect the truth, but instead advance an agenda.
Right. Do put their own bias into it and make it something, like Heather was saying, that wasn't what you really intended it to be. And but I think the military training probably gives as good a training as you can get anywhere, because when I went through it, it was an 8-week course from 8 in the morning till 5 at night with homework 5 days a week and homework on the weekends. And it's a crammed course, and you get a lot done. You learn a lot, and you learn it in a way that's more objective than I think you get if you do it now. But Heather?
So it's now 26 weeks. So I went through a 26-week course of 8 to 5. And so, I actually got my degree from Kent, and they actually gave me about 80 credits from going through that course. And really, what they teach you as you go through that course is you're a historical documentation person. What they determine to release, you, like he said, give them your unedited photos, or just edited so that you do contrast. But the story that's being told is supposed to be historical. Thousands of articles. You have a bias, I'd say, because you're trying to tell the Navy story in a positive light. But when something happens, such as Hurricane Katrina, you're going out there to document what's happening as you would document, a situation unfolding. So I would say that, from an ethical standpoint, the military really does have high ethical standards. I know a few journalists who have been kicked out of the military because they've edited photos, as he mentioned, and they'll kick them right out. They don't put up with that either, so.
Yeah.
That's good to know. I think we have a question right here. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Peter Serto. I work in communications for a progressive nonprofit. Your May 4th photos are astonishing. So we're talking about the challenges of covering activism. And so you define activists as people who want to change things, and that puts them into conflict oftentimes with the state. And so here in May 4th, you're covering students protesting the Vietnam War on the one hand, and the National Guard, who was capable of killing them, on the other hand. And so I think of that. I think of things like in Ferguson, Missouri, where you had protesters on the one hand, and you had these almost like Tiananmen Square photos of like them standing opposite large armored cars. And I'm wondering if it changes how you approach objectivity when there is this enormous power differential between parties to a conflict that you're covering.
So you're asking me how I would change my approach to...
Or do you have an affinity, right? When there's an enormous power differential, correct me if I'm getting your question wrong, but when there's an enormous power differential, do you develop an affinity for the people without power?
No, that's why you've got to keep your emotions and your sensibilities separate from that. If you start to get too involved with what you're doing, you lose it.
What do you lose?
Well, you'll start to take photographs that maybe enhance the opposition's point of view, so you're not manipulating your photograph, but you're documenting it in a way that supports their truth. And maybe that's hard to avoid, but I'm trying to think of that, because I lived in Washington, D.C. for a while, and every couple of days or once or twice, during the weeks, there'd always be protests, and my wife and I would go down to the protest area and take pictures. But yeah, your question's a tough one in terms of today's thing, because the bias becomes apparent. But I still think photojournalists really need to keep their perspective on, who they are and what they're doing it for. But I think that gets tougher now, because if you work for Sinclair Media, or if you work for this place, where are you going to feel comfortable getting a job today? Where are you going to feel that it's right because you took 800 images yesterday and they only use this one, and that only supports what they want to support, and you didn't mean it to be that way, because it's really telling a story if you have 2 or 3 photographs. So today, that's the conflict for me today, is the media is no longer objective, and you got to be careful who you work for.
Do you think about the one of the edicts that attracts a lot of people to journalism, which is to give voice to the voiceless, as part of what you're doing when you're documenting conflict?
Well, I don't document that much conflict. May 4th was the biggest conflict I documented. Could you ask me that again? I'm just not...
Well, I mean, when I look at particularly that image of the man who is essentially dying right there
Right.
on the ground, you gave him in his story voice.
Right.
If you had not taken that photo, his suffering would not have been documented in a way that so many people would have viscerally felt.
Right.
You gave him voice, and he was essentially voiceless, and he was also powerless, right? He was not, he didn't,
Right.
he didn't have a gun, he didn't have any power, he was a student. I feel like that is, I feel like you were doing that.
By giving him power, by giving him...
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but it wasn't, the intention was to document the result of something, and if it gave him voice, that was incidental to what my job was.
Just secondary motivation.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Other questions? Right here. And if you have a question, if you could raise your hand, we'll get the mic to you right now, and you can be next up.
Hi, my name is Susan Zimmerman. Now I'm the part-time faculty here at Kent State, teaching a sort of general writing class for applied communications majors. But I was a student reporter at the Kent Stater in the 1970s, so Howie and I
We know each other.
knew each other back then. And in the interim was a reporter for Reuters. And I just wanted to say that I incorporated that Reuters photo of Beirut in an exercise I developed called Photo Ethics. And I just wanted to point out that even though that was a freelance photographer for Reuters, as a result of that photo, Reuters developed a very complete and detailed photo ethics guideline, I believe still in use.
You're talking about the smoke photo where he had duplicated the smoke to make the scene look more dramatic.
Yeah, there was another photograph recently. This person won the World Wildlife Photo Competition with a photograph of an elephant. But somebody recognized the elephant and knew that the elephant used to have a notch in its ear. And when the judges found out, that person lost first place because he had doctored the photo.
He took the notch out?
Yeah, he made the ear perfect.
Huh, interesting. So unnecessary also,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. The idea that some photographers they want to do something that makes their picture perfect, but they lose sight of the fact that it doesn't need anything more than sharpening and making the correct exposure, and it's about all you want to do to it.
I mean, that's always been the challenge with documentary photography, whether you're talking about video or still, is there's this desire to have it be cinematic quality, right?
Yes.
And cinema is not most of the time documentary. It can have that impact, but it isn't in its essence documentary. Even documentary films sometimes in fact, most documentary films have a point of view.
Yes.
But journalism is a documentation of what happened, and anytime your production values change the truth of what happened,
Right.
you've sort of mixed up your values. I mean, production values are good. They make stuff pleasant to look at, easy to consume, but they can't change the truth of what happens.
See, that's what happened to McMurray. He, as a photojournalist, did a lot of work, but most of his work was staged because he worked with people in
He
foreign
was the
countries.
Nat Geo.
Yeah, but he stopped calling himself a photojournalist because he sells his images and he fixes them before he sells them. So, yes.
Yeah.
Hi, Howard. I'm Ron Kirksey.
Ron.
I was an Army journalist during Vietnam, so I don't think I learned as much as you Air Force people, but
Oh, you probably learned a lot.
my question is, it seems like the only people who care about ethics are the mainstream journalists, and that's slipping, as you mentioned, but Fox News doesn't care, Sinclair doesn't care, a lot of social media, and even the politicians. And I guess my question is, do you see this as a trend that's getting worse, or will we ever come back to the middle?
Oh, I see it as a trend that's getting worse, and I don't know what will cause it to change. There's going to have to be something that is so dramatic to offset something that people realize that, I can't trust photojournalists anymore. I can't trust, and so somebody's going to have to create a way of credentialing or certifying that, I don't want to say like it's organic, but you've got to find a way to make sure that what you do is representative of you and its truth. And who's going to authenticate that now?
Well, I actually think it's more dangerous than that. I mean, we know, we did a whole workshop on fake news. We know that there are lots and lots of forces that are trying to manipulate the information that's in the marketplace of ideas. It's, teenagers in Bosnia who are just doing it to get the remnant advertising on it. They're doing it for money. It's the Russians who are doing it to try and manipulate to voters around the
Facebook and
election.
stuff, yes.
It's political interests who are trying to smear their opponents. It's commercial interests, like people who are trying to sell vaping materials to children, right? Like there are so many forces that are trying to manipulate the truth that the danger is not that citizens won't be able to identify verifiable sources from unverifiable sources. The danger is that they'll become so cynical that they won't trust anything ever. They won't care about who's verified and who's a legitimate, well-motivated source of information.
Who will be the snoops for photojournalists?
Yeah.
Snoops.com.
All right, right here.
Hi, I'm Paula Slimak, and a graduate of the school, bachelor's and master's, former media person. Howard, would you talk a little bit about how the moments of truth in your images impacted testimony at the trials that you participated in against the Guard, and how lawyers regarded your images, and just the essence of the ethics in them implicit in the images?
When I went to the trials in Cleveland, I was the first witness on the stand, and I was on the stand for 3 days. And the purpose of my testimony was to introduce all the photographs as being true and accurate as to my recollection, whether they were mine or not, some of them, as long as I could recognize that that image was a true, an accurate depiction of what happened. And the trial was like, I'll give you an example of, my deposition took 8 hours before the trials. And it was very contentious because there's no rules in a deposition. And the purpose is to see what your breaking point is and where they can get you. So during the trial, they asked me if they put a picture up of somebody holding something in their hand, and He said, "Mr. Ruffner, did you see students throwing rocks?" And I said, "Well, I really didn't. You know, they may be in a picture of mine, but I didn't really see them." And he picks up a rock about the size of a big baked potato, and he puts it on the lectern in front of me and says, "Mr. Ruffner, would you say you saw rocks this size being thrown?" And he put it there. And I said, "No." And he walked away. And so the attorneys on the other side came up and said, "Judge, could we remove the rock from in front of our witness?" But the photographs were an incredible part of this whole thing. And like the photograph of the guard shooting, you know, why did they turn? Who shot first? We blew the photograph up of the guard with the .45 until it was as good as you can, and you know, who fired, what fired. The photographs were the critical part of the testimony, because when they came through, I think the photographs proved that there was no act of violence that endangered the lives of any guardsmen, and that's why they had to make their agreement to just settle out of court.
Well, how did you feel during those 3 days of testimony? Suddenly you're not doing your job as a documentarian, but you're doing a different job as a citizen, a really important one that I have no qualms with you doing. But how did that feel?
It was tough. It was tough in the sense that you have to maintain your composure and maintain your sense of reality there, because lawyers try to get you to be what they want you to be. So for me, it was just steeling myself to the situation and reacting in a very calm way to everything that was presented to me and answering with a truthful answer.
Did you feel like you were advocating for those students who'd been killed?
In a sense, yes, but all I was doing was really testifying that what was in front of everybody was the truth. So that may be advocating, but it wasn't an intentional advocating for them, because the photographs spoke for me.
It's interesting, though, how close that line is to telling the truth and becoming an advocate. And I think in journalism, there are times when journalism, in advocating for the truth, does advocate for victims, for people who have been who either have been the victims of abuses of power, or people who have been victims of a system that disempowers them.
My sense is that if I wasn't there and no one was talking about the photographs at the time, other than the fact that they had already been certified as being a truthful representation, they hadn't been manipulated, that you could lay the photographs out and the truth would speak for itself without me having to advocate for anything. So photographs really are moments of truth, and if you don't have to advocate, if they're speaking the truth for you, they're there.
Yeah.
Patty Newberry, I teach journalism at Miami of Ohio. Howard, could you have refused to testify? Related, were you still a student at that time, and did you have legal representation? I just wonder if you could have or should have refused to offer interpretation of the events when you documented them with your camera.
Well, it was 8 years after the event, and I was subpoenaed to testify. I can imagine I could have, but I felt so strongly that my photos spoke for me that I didn't feel it was to anybody's interest to not testify. I had no qualms about what I did and how I did it, so I didn't think anybody could question me on that.
I didn't realize the trial took 8 years.
Well, it was 8 years after the incident. And
Yeah,
then the retrial, or the last trial was 8 years, I think.
Really?
And I
That
was
was
the
a
lead
long
witness
time.
of both trials. And both trials, I was on the witness stand for the first 2 or 3 days. And the second trial is when they called the second witness, and while that person was testifying, they'd already reached an agreement, and they ended the case with the sad letter of, gee, we're not sorry, but it shouldn't have happened.
Yeah. And so you had no legal representation?
No, I had no legal representation.
And you weren't a student anymore?
No, I was working in Cleveland.
All right. Question there in the back.
Hi, wow. Hi, Kyle Eads, film student and part of the news organizations here on campus. I was just curious, and you may have already answered already. What was some of the perspectives of like your fellow students at the time after you've reported? Because you said you were trying to photograph both sides of the story, both the students' activism and the guards' activism. What was some of the perspectives of like your fellow students to you and how they reacted to it?
You mean after I took the photographs and?
Yeah, yeah.
There was no, the school was closed and everybody left and there was no discussion of anything. And like I said earlier, I had absolutely no idea what was on those images. It wasn't digital, so when I sent in 6 or 7 rolls of unprocessed film to Life, you can think what you have, and if, and unlike a photographer who might have been there on assignment, and I point this out in the book, is I had no assignment that said get a particular thing. I wasn't a newspaper photographer who's looking for that iconic photograph, and as soon as you get it, you just leave because you know what you've got. Or the TV crews say, I got a good 2 minutes here, 3 minutes, I can go now. So I was there for the duration. By the time it ended, it just ended for me, and reaction afterwards was, actually I didn't even see my photographs for a long time. So, and actually no one else had either, because the only pictures they ever saw were the ones on Life and 3 pictures inside. So.
Was Life weekly at that point?
I believe it was, yeah.
So it was the next
Yeah,
week that it came out?
And they, the magazines always date themselves a week or a month in advance, so it really came out like May 8th or something like that. Keep it fresh on the copy.
Yeah. It's interesting that they sent you back and transferred all the copyright back to you, which is lucky for you, right? You
Yes.
now own those photos. But really interesting that they didn't want to be part of the legal case. They basically sort of threw that all on you. So first question, how much did they end up paying you?
They paid me double their normal rate for the cover and inside pages, which came to a total of $2,000.
That's pretty good for a day's work.
Yeah, but if I had not been a photographer at that time, I could have sold those pictures for probably 4 times that, because I know that they paid other photographers twice that just to look at their negatives and proof sheets, and then paid them to have them printed.
Really?
So, it's, but I was an official stringer, and I got their day rate plus double, because it was a war zone. And, yeah.
Yeah. And so then you said that you didn't think that they were interested in the
Yeah, First Amendment.
First Amendment or even the legal battle that those photos were bound to be drawn into.
Yeah, I was a stringer. They had no responsibility to take care of anything, or they had no way, they didn't have to protect themselves, because once I was out, I was gone. They could do their business, so.
Yeah. Interesting. Question there.
John Kersey, I teach journalism at Cuyahoga Community College. I kind of want to follow up on what Kyle had asked. Even though all the students had been dispersed and were going home, you had to have feelings.
Did I what?
You had to have feelings. What was going through your heart and your head on May the 5th, May the 6th, the first few days after that? And a corollary question, if you don't mind, Howard. About 21 months before this happened at Kent State, where the protests at the Democratic National Convention and the chant, "The whole world is watching, the whole world is watching." Certainly, at some point, it dawned on you that people are going to ask you to use those pictures for their own purposes. How did you process those types of requests or, permission to use your pictures later on in your life?
Actually, that's a very interesting question, because I had no idea of the repercussions of people wanting to use the photographs or take advantage of them, and people had used them in postcards, and I would get a note from somebody saying that this, and I would write them and make sure they stopped using it. But one of the most interesting things was I was a student at Ohio University after I graduated from Kent, and the Ohio Bell was putting on a slideshow about what they do. And as I'm watching it, 2 or 3 of my photographs appeared. I'm going, I don't know why they're in the show, but so after the program, I walked up to the Ohio Bell representative and I said, well, how'd you get those photographs? Oh, we just used them. I said, well, who'd you get permission from? Oh, I don't know. And so, well, they're my photos. You didn't get permission, so I'm going to take you to sue you on those. And 3 years later, they hired me. But yeah, it was hard because a lot of people were using the photographs in a way that was not as I would have intended. And it was a new experience for me to make sure, like I said before, making sure you have control of your images is really critical because, and even today, it's even more critical today because you don't know how they're using them. But there are several web apps that you can use that you can take a picture of your photograph and say, where has this photograph been used? And it'll pop up. And I have a friend who made a photograph that he manipulated to make a kind of a statement photograph. And he found out it's being used all around the world. And he found out it was being used in Dubai. And he finally said something to the person in Dubai, and they sent him a check for $400. But yeah, you can find out now, but it's really hard to control how your stuff is used. And even if you have programs on your computer that say you can't download this, you can't copy it, you realize that you can, if you've got a Mac, I'm not sure how it works on a PC, but you can take a screenshot at 300 DPI and use that for pretty much anything you want. Even the pictures I took up here of the logos for some of these NAPP and AP, they don't let you drag them over and put them into a slide. I had to take a screenshot and drag it over to use it for today's service.
So you skipped over his first question, which was, how did you, after you sent the film to life, you had, and
Oh, yeah.
campus was closed down, what were those next couple days like for you?
Well, it was very nervous for me the first few hours because I didn't drive, I had no car, had no money. So another reporter here at the School of Journalism, Jim Fetters, offered to take me to the Akron Airport. And he drove me there after we left, and I put the film in a box, and Life magazine back then had paid for a seat for the film to go on the plane. And then Jim drove me to my house in Lakewood. And my brother reminds me that somebody from Kent, from the news office, had called my parents and said that they thought I had been shot. And so when I walked in the door about 7:30, it was the first time my parents knew that I was still okay. And they probably thought I had been shot because I was right in front of the guard. I was 80 feet in front of them when they turned and fired. And I just kind of went down on the ground just as the firing was going on. So Lewis was in front of me, Clary was to my left. So yeah, it was very contentious after that thing. And then the worrying about the film, I mean, Life magazine called me at 2 o'clock in the morning and said they couldn't find it.
Oh my gosh.
So, then another 2 or 3 hours later, they finally found the film and they said, yeah, we've got it now. And so another few days later, they called me in the morning to tell me it was going to be on the cover. So.
What about, did you suffer any sort of PTSD or any sort of emotional after effects?
I don't think so, but I've never gone to anybody to find out. When I realized I was, later on, just like other people who had been there, the idea that the guard were actually in my face with their M1s made me really think about my mortality at that time. And it was, scary enough. Because, having been in the military, I thought, or in any situation, I thought, well, one, they're firing blanks, or if they're really firing, they're just shooting in the air, just not to worry, until you start hearing the screams in the crowd. Oh my God, they're shooting real bullets, we've got to get down, stay down. That was when it really hit me that this was not a drill.
So here's a question from Twitter. Should photojournalists prioritize not being seen and potentially getting a low-quality photo, or getting the best photo and risk being seen? And I think this gets back to my question about influencing the behavior of the people you're trying to observe.
I think you can still get right up to what you're doing without influencing the scene, depending on how you act and what you do.
So it's more about calling attention to yourself?
Without calling attention to yourself. I think you can really do it. I mean, I photograph bands, and I have a wide-angle lens, and I get up right between them. But it doesn't mean they stop what they're playing or what they're doing or do it any differently. And I think if you're really careful and you're not there to, if you get in their face, that's different. But you can still do what you're going to do without getting in somebody's face and make it representative. And it's just, it's a matter of your own attitude and how you approach it. I mean, if you're skillful enough, people don't even recognize you. You know, they don't even know you're there. But that's up to the photographer, I think. They've got to be very careful. You know.
Yeah. All right.
But there were no questions about photographers who work for the National Enquirer or the tabloids in the supermarkets. Would you call them photojournalists?
Would you?
No.
That was a disingenuous question then, wasn't it?
But they get paid very well.
They do get paid very well, yeah. And they get paid to do something other than document the truth.
Right. And the same with paparazzi. You always see, when you see paparazzi, they're in your face, and you can see it in the photographs.
Right, they're provocateurs.
Yeah.
As opposed to documentarians.
And they get paid very well.
They do.
So if you're in it for the money,
Journalism's not your thing, man.
right.
All right, I think Jan is ready for us to wrap up here.
Yeah, so are there any more questions? Because if not, we're a little bit around the schedule here. So what I'd like to do at this point is stop, take a break, and then we'll come back with an introduction about activism and ethics, and then we'll go into the 11 o'clock session. I just want to let you know that Howard's book, Moments of Truth, which was up there a minute ago and looks just like this, is going to launch today from KSU Press, and some people from KSU Press are outside if you're interested in the book.